Well, thank you very much. I hope I meet that billing. I also have PowerPoint slides, but don't worry. I've noticed that, contrary to what David said, PowerPoint slides are never fatal. But this is the last session, and they cannot render you unconscious. So I'll do my best to sort of provide some messages while gently lulling you to bed. I'm also conscious that as was said, the PowerPoint slides, well, I think our colleague said, I wrote it down, take away the rather large picture of myself. In my case, they'll take away the picture of my rather large self. But what's the European Court of Auditors? One of the things you have to do, I don't think we charge for the use of the facility, but we do make you pay. And we make you pay by telling you a little bit about the Court of Auditors, whether it's soporific or not. Nowadays, we're about 900 people. In fact, if you include our trainees and so forth, we have 1,000 people on site. We produce 90 plus reports per year. Some of those are relatively small. One of them, our annual report on the EU budget, is quite huge, and it's a huge part of our output. We engage internationally with things like InterSci, EuroSci, and the rest, and we abide as closely as we can to the relevant international guidance and standards. Among our products, I've just mentioned the annual report. The principal focus of that is on accounts, compliance, regularity, a little bit on performance issues, and the thing that's always mentioned most is the error rate, the overall error rate and the error rate for sectors. We produce specific annual reports. Those are traditional financial audits on more than 50 joint undertakings and agencies of the EU. We provide, varies quite a lot from year to year, but of the order of 30 nowadays, special reports. Well, it used to be about 15 when I arrived first, so our productivity has increased. Special reports on particular themes, especially value for money themes and similar. Opinions on legislation, and occasionally broader landscape reviews. In what we do, though, and the reason I started bringing through this a little bit is that a lot of our development as a Court of Auditors is the mirror image of the European Commission's development as a financial administrator. So in our early years, we were founded in 1977. Our first couple of decades were mostly about trying to encourage better financial management in the EU, in the sense of better accounts, better reporting, more consistency. For an example, in 1977, we said the accounts submitted did not provide any assurance as to the financial position of the institutions, and provided no documentation regarding their accounting systems and practices. Imagine that. But by the mid-90s, we were still reporting a lack of an adequate and complete accounting framework. But by the early 2000s, there was a real movement towards reform, pushed by us, but the impetus was coming from within the Commission itself. There was a modernization, a shift to accruals, supported by ourselves, by the European Parliament, by external commentators, but very much generated from within the Commission. So that from 2007 onwards, we were able to give a sort of a true and fair opinion of the accounts. And from 2011 onwards, a favourable and unqualified opinion on the accounts. You can imagine as the accounting system started to improve, as the financial accountability improved, both ourselves and the Commission were able to shift our thinking a little bit towards performance. So from about the mid-90s onwards, you see a greater emphasis in the court on performance audit, on value for money audit. I checked this during the week with one of the colleagues. So it was about 1994 when our first audit, we had performance auditing built into, for the first time, our audit manuals. And we now have a separate performance audit manual. So this is more or less what we do here. But the thing I'm really trying to stress is that this is the mirror image of what the Commission is doing. We reflect their activity, we push them in particular directions, but but we are in lockstep. We are symbiotic in terms of how we develop over time. Now, you would think, as I mentioned the Commission so much, that our accountability system is in principle relatively quickly. You have relatively simple. You have an actor. In our case, the principal auditee is the European Commission, and you have a forum for an accountability, a European Parliament, in our case. And that there'll be an audit process that aids the Parliament's scrutiny of the activities of the executive body, and that the Parliament then, or the parliamentary system, provides feedback and corrective action as regards the executive. And indeed, in principle, that's sort of what happens in Europe. The Commission, our principal auditee, accounts to the Parliament and the Council. There are co-legislators. The Council is the Council of European Ministers. And there is a scrutiny, and there is what they call a discharge process, a process in which the legislators actually go through the accounts provided by the Commission, audited by us, in great detail, and they feedback by way of a discharge resolution in which they actually give very detailed feedback on what they want to change, and then at the end they grant or do not grant. In fact, they have usually granted a discharge, which means that they are accepting the accounting of the Commission for that particular year. So in principle, very simple, but actually in practice not nearly so. Because unfortunately, from a simplicity point of view, there's not just a European Commission. The European Commission has many directorates general, but there are also many other European agencies. I mentioned 50 plus agencies, joint undertakings. There are, I think, 8 now European institutions, including ourselves, the European Court of Justice. There are institutions that are in the European system, but not within the treaty framework in the same way, like the European Investment Bank, the European Stability Mechanism. And so the audit universe is enormous. And we don't just expect nowadays scrutiny and accountability to the parliamentary system or to the legislators. We expect, in Europe, that accountability will also be to national parliaments, to regional parliaments, to regional governmental systems. Directly nowadays, we expect it that we will involve our citizens, so that's more than 500 million people. Even the European Council, which is the sort of co-legislator, has, I think I have a number there, 10 different configurations. So the task we expect of the auditees are really quite enormous. We expect them to be able to account at multiple levels on a real-time basis to enormous volumes of people, all of whom have a different interest. No one has the same interest. There are, I think, I counted, something like 10,000 parliamentarians in the mix, and that doesn't include regional parliaments in Europe. Quite a huge job. For those of you who are Brexit fans, I think there's about 2,000 of those 10,000 parliamentarians are in the UK, so it'll reduce the number somewhat. And also, believe it or not, the audit system is quite complicated too, because while we hope we are a sort of a primus inter pares as far as EU spending is concerned, but there are national and regional auditors involved. There are audit boards and committees in some of the institutions or bodies we talk about. There are private external auditors for EIB, European Central Bank, that do the financial audit. And then we insist on there being internal audit. We often look at the quality of internal audit. So there is a hugely complex audit system as well as a hugely complex audit universe. And now, this is a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that citizens lose trust when the powers and complexity of the system, the European Union, are out of balance with the accountability and legitimacy in terms of democratic legitimacy of the Union. And that complexity that I just talked about must be a factor in any loss of trust, because if matters are so complex, both at the auditee side but also at the scrutiny side, where does the citizens whose trust we want to support, where does the citizen look? What should their focus be? Who should they listen to? And after the financial crisis, actually, matters got, and because we're talking about uncertainty, when you have times of uncertainty, there is an institutional response. And the institutional response, properly I think in this case, but it is never to reduce the number of structures and bodies concerned, because you're trying to do things quickly. Abolition takes much more time than construction of a body. So we have more bodies, new structures with different arrangements, new uses of and demands on the existing structures, new sets of rules, and a mix, for us a complication, a mix of EU treaty based instruments and non-EU instruments being adopted and managed by the same people as are using the EU instruments. So the situation, we have, well, EU accountability is a complex, enormous industry now, not just a single, simple process. There are, as you can imagine in this, some gaps, big overlaps, and real deficits in the system, which creates a risk to levels of public trust. And the reason I think this is worthwhile for the CIPFA audience to sort of think about it is that if you think about it, at national level, very often the same things arise, because you have national accountability structures which have to report to regions and local authorities and to county and city level. You have regional governments that account to national governments. So many of the same complexities that arise for us in the EU context arise at the national level, and the same kinds of problems, therefore, can be expected to be arising. Now, we tried to diagnose this a little bit. We produced a document called a landscape review about 2 years ago, in which we tried to look at where were the sources of these complexities, and the areas of challenge for the future. Well, at a first basic point, we noted that in the EU in particular, a lot of activities are coordinated by the EU that are not really EU activities. We have the Europe 2020 initiative, for example, which is where all the member states and the EU came together to develop a strategy for the next 10 years or so. Wonderful, but that's the member states and the EU combined. It's not an purely EU initiative institutionally, and therefore it's difficult to say where the scrutiny for that should be. Where is the accountability for that? This is our highest level strategy, but the accountability and the scrutiny are diffused throughout 28 member states and the European Union system. There are other initiatives that you could say the same about. Then we have different groups of member states that participate differently in different policy areas. So in Europe we have Schengen, includes most but not all of the European Union and 1 or 2 non-EU countries. We have the Customs Union, includes all of the European Union countries and 1 or 2 non-European Union countries. We have the Euro area, which includes only a subset of European Union countries. And we have a monetary system, the European system of central banks, which includes all of the European Union member states, but a European central bank, which includes only the Euro area. We have a Euro group, which in some formal sense probably doesn't really exist. It's an informal gathering, but which makes decisions among the members of the Euro group. So different groups of countries are participating differently in the European Union initiatives, and therefore you get problems of accountability there. Not just audit, also accountability, because remember, if you have a European Parliament, some of the people in the single market, some of the countries in the single market are not represented at all in the Parliament. If the European Parliament is scrutinizing the European Central Bank, well, then you have representatives from non-EU, non-Eurozone member states scrutinizing the activities of a purely Eurozone activity. So a lot of things to be worked through there. Another audit problem, and therefore accountability problem indirectly, is that our audit tends to be limited to the stage where funds are paid over. So that means we don't have full sight over what happens to funds. If the European Union, as part of its development aid activity, gives a direct grant to a member state, or to a third country rather, then we audit at that point. We audit the transaction certainly at that point. We say there's no error in the transaction, but we don't know whether the recipient country then makes multiple errors. And it might not be a country, it might be a PPP partner or many other kinds of recipient of European Union money who are expected to do something with it, but the financial accountability stops at the point where the transaction happens. Different institutions within the EU have different accountability structures. We are the auditor of the ECB, only for the operational efficiency of the management. Then there is an external auditor for the finances, financial accounts, and then there is anything that is not either financial accounts or operational efficiency of the management is not auditable at all. For the Commission, we have full audit rights and a full audit remit. For the EIB, which is a European body, but it's a body composed by shareholders who are all the European Union member states. So we don't audit the EIB unless the EIB is acting in partnership with the Commission, in which case we audit the Commission's end. It becomes quite complex. In the terms of the management of the EU budget, a lot of the management is through what we call shared management. So the payments out, the payment decisions themselves are made at the member state level. About 80% of the budget is composed of that. And probably of all the things that's most important in terms of EU accountability, well, the EU, I worked in Ireland in the financial crisis. It was a dreadful time. And I knew we were in trouble when someone said to me in a meeting, well, you know, 10 billion doesn't go very far. The EU's budget is, off the top of my head, 140, 150 billion, something like that. In terms of the size of Europe, the European system, it's not very big. It's actually a very small amount of money for a, you know, if you wanted to think of the European Union as a supranational government, it's very small. That means two things. It means that all the things that people really care about happen at the local level. It means that health, policing, education, those are all done nationally. So it's sort of easier to take your eye off the ball about Europe or to criticize Europe, because in a sense it's easier to criticize those things that you don't care about. And if it's not policing, education and health, people care much less. But it also means that relative to the other power that the EU has, the money is less important. The other power the EU has is the power to make laws. And it makes a lot of them. And they are really, really important in the lives of our citizens. Huge numbers of, huge amounts of legislation directly affecting EU citizens on a day-to-day basis. And our audit remit is in relation to budget lines. Now, of course, everything has some small budget line, so it means we do get to audit a lot sort of non-budgetary activity, but it's a thing that we have been moving into over time. It's not where we started. And for many people around the audit community around the world, there are differences of view as to whether they are really auditing budgets or whether they are auditing activity. If you want a performance focus, you have to audit activity, and the budget might be small relative to the activity. If, for example, we have to make policy choices between a tax break, a tax expenditure, a parliamentary grant of funds, or a regulatory action, we have to be able to audit and scrutinize those three things in a holistic way, so as to be able to compare the value of one against the other. And in audit systems, we have built our audit systems around, starting from the premise that they are audits of budgets, and we have to think about whether that's the correct premise for the future. So I tried to take some of that and put it into a couple of tables. In terms of our challenges for the future, our challenges in terms of institutions, dealing with fragmented scrutiny, ensuring that we have good holistic systems, not perfect systems, they don't exist, but good, reasonably comprehensive systems. We have to deal for the future with the accountability of a multi-speed Europe. And Europe in the modern world is not just the EU, it's the EU and many other countries around Europe which interact with it in various ways. We have to address audit scope limitations if we want proper scrutiny. More about that in the next few weeks, but our recent audit of the ECB dealt in part with the audit of the ECB and in part with the limitations we have in doing that. We have to address inconsistent audit setups and differences between member state audit of European money, European audit of European money, and so forth. That's at the institutional level. At the technical level, we have to think about our methodologies and our practices in terms of auditing regulatory actions and policy actions rather than budgets. We have to think at a technical level about how to handle coherent auditing in this very diverse and I hope I've proven complex environment. Maintaining and developing audit expertise, because frankly you need real expertise for this kind of situation, and developing new audit methodologies to deal with the challenges of the future. Those are the technical challenges that at least those are the ones I've brainstormed. But actually, at the technical level, maybe it's different, but at the institutional level, most of these things are out of our hands. So we don't determine the institutional setup of the European Union, just as member state auditors don't determine the institutional setups of their member states or their federal systems or whatever. So we need, if we see a problem, to discuss the problem, to engage, and we need engagement with other stakeholders to make progress. We need, in the European context, to communicate the audit gaps we see and the inconsistencies we see to the lawgivers. And those are not just in the European context at European level, but also at national level. We need to explain better to stakeholders and members of the public what is the importance of this scrutiny system for them, so that they will encourage and support this kind of institutional adjustment. We need to maintain strictly our independence, because if we become the servant, given the situation is so complicated, if we become the servant of any one stakeholder, then we cease to be able to serve all the others properly. We need to develop our own understanding of the auditee, for which we mean we require much greater and greater engagement with them. But also as an audit and public management community, we need to engage better with each other. We have in Europe 28 national audit institutions. Each of them has its own national remit. Each of those is sometimes subtly, sometimes very largely different from the other. And then we have the European Court of Auditors, and we have all sorts of forums and contact groups and so forth. But we don't yet really collaborate in an in-depth way, except on a sort of a quasi-experimental basis. We collaborate to a point, but in terms of audit product, not really. We need also to think about better integration, so that that one can say there is a reasonable chain of custody almost in terms of who is in charge of auditing particular parts of the EU budget or of national budgets that are associated with them. That requires better discussion in order to get agreement. We need essentially common standards, and I think actually, in fairness, a lot of work has been done, in particular at the INTESI level, on those. And for better efficiency, we need to share learning. So we need to share methodologies and technologies and so forth. And again, the level of contact that there is has ensured that there is a good deal of sharing of audit techniques and technologies, of public financial management techniques and technologies in the past few years. So, in terms of the way forward, it's such a complex situation that there are no simple solutions. But we need to start. I think we in the court we have started that process of engaging actors at as many levels as we can, member state, regional, EU, and more. But if you talk about the broader accountability structure, not just the audit structure, then there are other actors who have to do the same. We need to start to address the existing problems that we've already tried to catalogue, but when new initiatives come along, and they come along regularly, we need to build the new initiatives with accountability in mind. So you shouldn't build your new institution and then think how you make it accountable. You should build your new institution with accountability as part of its core. So that's, I think, all I have to say, and I hope one or two of you have managed to not be either fatally put to death or put to sleep by that. Thank you.